In 1795, the British Royal Navy sailed into Table Bay and took the Cape Colony by force. The Dutch surrendered, but then, just a few years later, Britain gave it all back. This is the story of a strategic prize caught in the crossfire of revolution, fear, and secret letters from exile, of restless farmers forgotten on the frontier, of a colony caught between empires collapsing and colliding. Welcome to the Lost History Files, and to the first British capture of the Cape of Good Hope. In 1795, the world was ablaze, not in a metaphorical sense, but literally in places. The flickering flames of revolution that began in Paris had swept across Europe like a firestorm through dry grass. France, once the most powerful monarchy on the continent, had guillotined its king. The Ancien regime had crumbled. In its place stood the French Republic, bold, uncertain, and deeply threatening to the old order. To Britain, revolutionary France was more than an enemy. It was a disease, a contagion, a fever of ideas that had to be contained, not just in Europe, but wherever France might extend its reach, and that meant everywhere. Thousands of miles from the guillotines of Paris, nestled at the foot of a mountain they called Table, the Cape Colony watched Europe convulse. Governed by the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, the Cape was no jewel, no El Dorado, but it was something better, strategic. A halfway mark on the vital trade route to India, a place for ships to take on fresh water and salted meat before rounding the southern continent and sailing towards empire. For Britain, intent on maintaining its access to India, the Cape was not a luxury, it was a necessity. But in 1795, the Dutch themselves were no longer who they had been. Earlier that year, French forces had invaded the Netherlands. William V, Prince of Orange, had fled to England. The old Dutch Republic, centuries old, collapsed overnight. In its place rose the Batavian Republic, a revolutionary state aligned with France. This was no mere name change. It was a radical new political order, sweeping away the old oligarchies and ruling classes. But with it came instability and uncertainty. For the distant colonists in the Cape, the Batavian Republic was a remote and confusing presence, one that many saw as a puppet of France's revolutionary ambitions. Which meant that now, Britain's access to the Cape could fall under French control. That couldn't be allowed. The French revolutionaries had eyes on trade routes. In London, alarm bells rang, not with sound but with ink. Letters, orders, secret plans. Because when you're fighting a revolution, the war isn't just in Europe. It's in the harbours, it's in the colonies, it's on the high seas. Britain's eyes became fixed firmly on the prize, the Cape of Good Hope, the key to maintaining their imperial lifeline to India and the East. For British leaders, the decision was clear. The Cape had to be secured, by force if necessary. Not as conquerors, they claimed, but as guardians, preventing a French expansion that would threaten the balance of power and the safety of Britain's global empire. The Dutch Republic was gone. Its last ruler, William V of Orange, had fled to England. He was a monarch without a country, a governor without a colony. But what he still had, for now, was the loyalty of some of the Dutch overseas territories, and a pen. In July 1795, from his temporary residence at Kew Palace near London, William issued a series of instructions to Dutch colonial governors across the globe. These weren't diplomatic letters, they were orders, but without an army or navy to enforce them. He urged the colonies still under Dutch control, particularly the Cape, to place themselves under British protection for safekeeping. Better British than French. These became known as the Q letters. But what exactly were they? Royal directives? A request from a refugee prince? Or something more calculated? A convenient cover for British imperial ambition? To the British government, they were a godsend. They offered legitimacy. They allowed Britain to move against the Cape not as a conqueror, but as a protector of Dutch interests, a rescuer of a colony at risk. To the Dutch loyal to William, this made a kind of tragic sense, but to others, especially those now aligned with the Batavian Republic, the letters were nothing less than treason. And for the colonists at the Cape, they caused confusion and worse, division. Was the Cape still Dutch? Whose Dutch? Should the garrison resist the British or welcome them? In Cape Town, the acting governor, Abraham Sluisken, was caught between orders, loyalties and practical realities. He received the Q letters with scepticism. He was no monarchist, and he didn't trust the British, but he also knew what was coming. British ships had already been sighted off Simon's Bay, and resistance might mean bombardment. Further inland, beyond the relative calm of Cape Town, the picture was more volatile. The districts of Swellendam and Graaff-Reinet had long been hotbeds of unrest. Settlers there, mostly Boer farmers known as burghers, lived hard lives on the frontier, isolated from official government and far from the comforts of the coast. Settlers here chafed under heavy taxes, disputes over land ownership, and a lack of effective governance. The result was open revolt, violent resistance that further undermined the colony's unity and ability to resist external forces. Their farms were vast, their neighbours few, and their struggles many. They battled not only the wildness of the land and the uncertainty of droughts and disease, but also tense and often violent relations with indigenous communities. Life was rough. Taxation by the VOC, arbitrary justice and corruption among officials fueled their resentment. Once the world's most powerful trading company, the VOC began to collapse in the late 1700s. Corruption ran deep, with officials more focused on personal profit than company success. At the same time, rising competition from the British and French, combined with declining profits and costly wars, strained the company's resources. The VOC's empire had become too large to manage, and defending it drained money fast. Debt piled up, and by the 1780s, the company was borrowing just to stay afloat. Its monopoly on trade slipped away, and investor confidence collapsed. The burghers of Swellendam and Graaff-Reinet had already declared their independence from the company's rule in 1795, the same year as the British move on the Cape, creating short-lived breakaway republics. They sought self-rule, local control, and freedom from distant bureaucrats who seemed indifferent to their daily hardships. One settler wrote in his diary, "We are men of this land, and yet we live beneath the yoke of strangers. The company taxes us like cattle, and offers us no protection." Another letter from the frontier expressed a bitter truth. "We cannot rely on Holland or England to defend us. Our fate rests with our own hands." These rebellions drained the Dutch colonial government's strength. With officials distracted and resources stretched, the Cape's ability to mount a unified defence against a British invasion was seriously compromised. The burghers' revolt meant that forces which might otherwise have resisted the British were instead tied down suppressing internal dissent. The British would later find allies amongst some of these settlers, whose desire for autonomy made them wary of Batavian authority, even if they did not fully trust the British either. Because now the British fleet was in position. A squadron under Vice Admiral Sir George Elphiston, carrying troops commanded by General James Henry Craig, had arrived at Simonstown. They bore copies of the Q letters. They offered terms. They promised protection, order, and neutrality. But behind the promises stood soldiers, cannons, and warships. Governor Sluiskin stalled. He delayed. He negotiated. But there was no doubt about it. If he did not accept British occupation, the British would take the Cape by force. This was not the quiet handover the Q letters had envisioned. This was the slow unfolding of an invasion in the name of protection, justified on paper, but loaded with powder and shot. And so it came to this. With diplomacy exhausted and tension mounting, the British would attack. The stage was set. A divided colony, a weakened Dutch government, and a British fleet at the shore. What happened next would change the Cape forever. On the morning of August the 7th, 1795, British forces landed east of Cape Town, near the small coastal hamlet of Muizenberg. It was little more than a fishing village and a wagon road, but it held the high ground, and from there the road to Cape Town ran open. The terrain was rugged and unforgiving. Low, scrubby hills rolled down towards the beach, dotted with thick patches of fynbos and scattered gum trees. The sun climbed steadily, promising heat by midday, with clear skies that offered no shelter for those on the battlefield. The 78th Highlanders, many fresh from European campaigns, marched off the landing crafts with a mix of nervous anticipation and grim determination. One private, writing later in a letter home, recalled, "The sea air is brisk, but my feet ache from the damp ground. We know the Dutch are few, but the land is strange and the days long." Their officers tried to keep spirits high, encouraging steady progress despite the weight of muskets and the heat. Across the narrow defile that guarded the road, the Dutch defenders were no less fatigued. Governor Sluiskin and Colonel Robert Gordon commanded fewer than 1,000 men, a patchwork force of company regulars, local militia, and burgher volunteers, many farmers pressed into service. For them, this was not just a military position. It was their home, their farms, their families at stake. One burgher's diary, found decades later, captured the tension. "We are outnumbered, but we know every path and rock here. Still, the guns of the English roar louder than our own, and the men grow tired with every hour." The naval bombardment began early, with HMS America and HMS Stately raining iron shot upon the Dutch lines. Dutch cannons answered bravely but ineffectively, their powder damp, their guns fewer, their crews fewer still. The booming of artillery echoed along the coastline, shaking the earth beneath soldiers' feet and frightening the local populations. As the infantry advanced in two waves, British redcoats and Marines pushed steadily uphill along the narrow road. The Dutch defence gradually crumbled. By midday, they fell back from the pass towards Weinberg, their lines thinned and morale shaken. The retreat was orderly but bitter, a painful acknowledgement that resistance might only bring ruin to the colony and its people. The real damage, however, was psychological. The people of Cape Town, watching from a distance, understood that the tide had turned. The once mighty VOC was now powerless to defend the colony. Burgher militias quietly disbanded, and local elites weighed their loyalties and futures. Governor Sluiskin, caught between a collapsing front and a restless town, held out for a few more weeks, but he had no reinforcements and no friendly neighbours. On September the 16th, after negotiations with Sir George Elphiston, he agreed to capitulate. The British had taken Cape Town. They disarmed the garrison, took control of the Castle of Good Hope, and raised the Union flag above Table Bay. Between 1795 and 1802, the Cape Colony underwent major changes under British occupation. The British replaced the VOC with a military administration, while still retaining Romano-Dutch law. The Cape quickly became a key British naval base on the route to India, with stronger fortifications and a growing British military presence. Trade, once controlled by the VOC, opened up to British merchants, linking the Cape more directly to Britain and India. Socially, life remained largely the same for settlers and enslaved people, but British officials, language and customs began to make their mark. Although Dutch culture stayed dominant, English started to appear in official settings, laying early groundwork for future tensions. Britain had taken the Cape, but would they keep it? Not yet, because peace, of a sort, was coming. By 1801, Britain was tired, its treasury strained, its people weary of war, its fleets stretched thin from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. France, too, under the rising star of Napoleon Bonaparte, was willing, for the moment, to pause. The result was a fragile piece of parchment signed in March 1802, the Treaty of Amiens. It was meant to end hostilities between the major European powers. It marked the only break in nearly 2 decades of war, and among its many clauses, hidden among the lines redrawing the map of the world, was a provision of deep consequence for southern Africa. Britain would return the Cape Colony to the Dutch, not to the old Republic, but to the Batavian Republic, now a client state of Napoleonic France. For the British, this was no surrender. They had taken the Cape as a wartime precaution. With peace restored, they argued, the colony should revert to its prior owners. It was a gesture of goodwill, and for some, an uncomfortable one. In the halls of Parliament, the decision ignited heated debate. Many strategists and merchants spoke of the Cape's vital importance, its harbours, its commanding position on the sea route to India, and its growing commercial potential. Some warned that relinquishing the Cape would hand a critical choke point to France's allies. Others countered that the treaty was a necessary peace, a respite to rebuild Britain's strength. The issue split the nation. Politicians argued not only over geopolitics, but over honour, trust, and the future of empire. Across the North Sea, in the Batavian Republic, the mood was cautiously optimistic, but fraught with uncertainty. The Dutch welcomed the return of the Cape as a chance to revive their colonial pride and influence, yet the realities on the ground presented daunting challenges. In February 1803, British forces departed the Cape. Dutch ships sailed into Table Bay. Among them was Lieutenant General Jan Willem Janssens, a man whose character and leadership style would profoundly shape the colony's turbulent next chapter. Janssens was no company man, a career soldier and devoted Republican. He carried with him the ideals of reform and discipline, forged in the upheavals of Europe's revolutionary era. Stern yet pragmatic, he viewed the Cape not merely as a distant outpost, but as a strategic jewel, requiring him to bring order, listen to advisers, and engage with the colony's fractious communities. Yet Janssens was burdened by the enormity of his task, governing a colony still smarting from war, beset by factionalism, and vulnerable to the shifting winds of European power politics. Alongside Janssens arrived Commissioner General Jacob Abraham de Mist, charged with remaking the colony's civil administration. Together, they sought to reduce the corruption endemic under VOC rule, modernise the legal system, and promote education and economic development. They faced a colony that was no longer the sleepy trading post it had once been. The British interlude, though brief, had left its mark. British merchants, entrepreneurial, connected to London's financial hubs, had expanded trade and entrenched new economic networks. Cape Town's streets echoed with a new language and new customs. The British garrison, now gone, had nonetheless left behind families and ideas. Many settlers, particularly the more Anglophile burghers, looked with mixed feelings on the return of Dutch rule. Reactions among Cape Town's inhabitants were complex and often contradictory. Indigenous populations and enslaved communities watched with cautious eyes. The Khoikhoi sensed further instability. Many enslaved people hoped for change, but feared the tightening control and laws both regimes enforced. Worse still, Janssens and de Mist faced a deeper problem, one no treaty could fix. The Cape was no longer a quiet backwater. It had become a prize, eyed jealously by empires and caught between competing visions of power. And peace, as everyone suspected, would not last. By 1803, the Treaty of Amiens was already fraying. In Europe, tensions mounted. Napoleon's ambitions grew bolder. British distrust returned. Ships were built. Armies drilled. In London and The Hague, cautious voices whispered of the treaty's failure. And in Cape Town, where Dutch colours once again flew over the castle, there was a feeling in the air, familiar and ominous. Britain had given the Cape back, but not for long, because the peace would collapse, war would return, and so would the British, as a permanent imperial presence. That is the story of our next episode. But for now, we leave the Cape in a strange moment, not quite Dutch, not quite British, not quite at peace, just waiting. Thanks for watching this episode of the Lost History Files. If you enjoy uncovering stories like this, the forgotten, the overlooked, the hidden, please like, comment, subscribe and share.